Welcome, members. Welcome, guests. I'm Tom Collmore, CFA from the board of CFA Stamford, and it's my pleasure and honor to welcome a repeat speaker, presenter for CFA Stamford, our good friend, David Ranson. I'll provide a very brief bio, but the more elaborate bio is on our website if you care to take a look. David is the president and director of research of HCWE and Company, formerly Wainwright Economics, an independent research firm. David has taught at the University of Chicago, where he has his PhD, and he has degrees as well from Queens College, Oxford, and University of Chicago. David has an impressive CV. Take a look again at the bio on the website. It includes senior positions in the U.S. Treasury Department. David is widely published, including the Wall Street Journal, etc. We have 4 topics today. I'll just quickly run through them: government spending and the effects on the economy, tax rates and the effects on tax revenues, interest rates as set by the Fed and the impact on inflation, and finally, and very provocatively, tariffs and the effect on inflation. I don't think there could be a more pressing topic ripped from the pages of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, or whatever, as they say. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to David.
Thank you. It's a delight to be here and a privilege. I'd like to start by commenting about the word debunking in my title, which of course tends to draw an audience. But I want to say something about debunking. It's a lot easier to disprove something than to prove it. And it's actually hard to even disprove something. And this is particularly true in economics. What is possible to do, and in fact quite doable, is to debunk the evidence in favor of a particular point of view or belief. To disprove it is much more ambitious, and to prove something in place of it is more ambitious still. So I'm not going to be very ambitious. I'm going to be looking at how we can dispel what evidence people may think favors a certain belief about the economy and how it works and how the government works to achieve its objectives. Another introductory point I'd like to make is about beliefs. That's really what we're looking at here. The word myth, of course, is pejorative. People have beliefs about the economy, and it's interesting to ask, where do these beliefs come from? And one could be and should be common sense. Another could be intuition. A third is simplicity. In science, you always want the simplest possible explanation. As Einstein famously said, the most simple approach you can take, but no simpler than the simplest, as he joked. And then there is wishful thinking, unfortunately. Wishful thinking certainly motivates beliefs a great deal. Finally, the scientific approach, there is observation. Observation includes collecting the data for long periods of history and looking at what we can learn from the data. And that is what I practice most of the time. And I'd like to share with you what I come up with on this relatively narrow field of the effective government policy on the economy. And I do it through mostly, as other economists do, we look at correlations. And I'll come back to correlations and talk about those as we go on. I'd like to start just by showing you the data. And you'll see in the graph in the first page, the first exhibit, I'm going back for a long history. And that has to do with why taking certain approach to get the best, most informative correlations from history. The longer the history, the more secure you can be in whatever the correlations show. So I'm using the longest possible history that I can easily put together here for the role of the federal government in the economy, just the basic data here for GDP, And of course, over this hugely long time frame, I do have to use a ratio scale because there's a huge astronomical difference between the size of what was going on in 1929 and what it is today. And so on this same scale, I can draw what happened to federal spending and what happened to federal receipts. And we can draw a few conclusions just from the raw data. Spending has, on the whole, grown faster than receipts. Another thing you can see in this graph, which I'll return to later, because it's quite significant, is that federal receipts seem to be running consistently since the early years in parallel with GDP. They're not getting closer to the GDP line the way the spending line is, and that has a cause which I'll address later. And what I'm interested in, arising directly out of that first graph, is what's the connection between the growth of the economy and the growth of federal spending? And we're already into mythical territory. There are lots of people who have believed for a very long time, and some still do, that federal spending is a boost to the economy. Well, it's not super simple. If you look at that history that I was just showing you and analyze it and look for correlations, one of the things you find out is that the correlation is not the same during wartime, especially major wars like the ones I've mentioned here, as it is in peacetime. And of course, the peacetime years are much more numerous than the wartime years, so I've separated them. And then to find a correlation for the peacetime years, my standard approach is to divide my history into sub-histories. And we have a sub-history in which government spending rose a great deal, another sub-history in which government spending declined, and there could be several sub-histories in between. In this case, we just have the three sub-histories, and we find lower growth of real GDP in the decades in which the spending grew the most, and a higher growth rate of GDP in the decades where the spending declined. So there we have there a belief which is contradicted by evidence. It would be very difficult to reassert the belief in the face of this evidence, but not impossible. You can always dig deeper into the evidence and find something else that you've missed. And I want to emphasize that point in several other applications. We're looking for a correlation, and it's straightforward here. I haven't dug very much deeper than what you see in the table, but correlations can sometimes be simultaneous and sometimes they're not. Sometimes one of the variables you're correlating leads and the other lags. Correlations can also be linear, but sometimes they're not. This looks like one that isn't really linear because the difference between the middle line and the bottom line is, as far as GDP is concerned, is much smaller than the difference between the top line, that is the first of the three lines, and the middle line. So that's something else to look out for. If you assume that something is simultaneous when it's not, you may get the wrong conclusion. If you assume that something is linear when it's not, you may also get the wrong conclusion. And correlations can also change over time. I'll come to that later. But we do need a long history, and that's one thing that this table illustrates. I've been able to take the data all the way back to 1840, and if we get this relationship showing this strongly for such an enormously long period of time, we can feel with some confidence that we've got something that is true, and even if it contradicts what a lot of people may think. Moving on to the third slide. Here is federal spending divided into two major types of spending. It makes a big difference which one you look at, and there are other types. I'm only looking at the two broadest types. In general, I'm looking at all of my illustrations and thoughts here to share with you are what you could call broad brush. We can break the data down into far more detail than I have time in this presentation to do. In fact, there's more detail than we can ever really master. And sometimes the conclusion you draw from the broad brush approach may be more complicated, if it could even be overturned to a degree when you look at further detail. And I want to put that in as another warning about the dangers of going too far with this kind of work. Well, here is the general background, back to 29 again, for federal spending. And there are two major kinds of federal spending. I won't be looking at the other kinds, which are smaller. One is spending where the government is getting something for its money, a quid pro quo. So defense spending, for example, that's considered to be a purchase of goods and services. That's the phraseology that's been used for many, many years. I think the government keeps changing its methodology, its descriptions, or the phraseology that it uses. And if you look at the national income accounts today, you won't find this phrase anymore. You'll find something called consumption, that is federal government consumption. I find that to be not as good a phrase. This tells you what's going on much better. The federal government is spending, but it's getting something in return for its spending. That's a purchase of goods and services. The other kind is transfer payments. That's where there is no quid pro quo, or no very close quid pro quo. The government is giving money to hopefully deserving candidates. It could be industries or companies, it could be foreign countries, foreign governments, it could be individuals and families. Those are transfer payments where nothing is owed in return. What we see in the history then, one basic fact is that transfer payments started out very, very small and have grown drastically, very, very fast over the long period of time, and are getting closer and closer to the plot showing total federal spending, the red line. Whereas current purchases of goods and services are, if anything, falling behind the level of total spending. So what's clearly happening is that purchases are becoming a smaller and smaller part of the picture, and transfer payments are becoming a larger and larger part of the picture. Just an interesting observation. Now let's analyze. We do have to analyze transfer payments and purchases of goods and services separately. And you'll see why when you see the data that I'm going to show you. Here are the data on federal purchases of goods and services and their effect on the rest of the economy, not the total GDP, of which they are a part, but the rest of GDP, which we could broadly call the private sector. And as usual, I'm dividing the history into sub-histories, not chronologically, but in this case, I'm dividing them according to whether the spending increased a lot, or increased moderately, or didn't hardly change, or diminished moderately, or diminished a lot. So we have 5 sub-histories. And here are the data in the blue line. We've got the one-year change in federal consumption and investment, which is the same thing as purchases of goods and services. And these figures attached to the bars, the heights of the bars, are the averages for each sub-history. So you see the blue bars start at 13, then 2.3, 0.1, minus 3.4, and minus 17.9. Now, to demonstrate a correlation, we plot on the same scale the change in the private sector's share of the GDP that accompanies and follows the change in the federal spending. And here's an example where we don't have a simultaneous relationship. It's partially simultaneous, but if we only look at the simultaneous relationship, we'd be missing a serious part of the story. So I have included a second year to give the private sector enough time to fully adjust to what the federal government has done when it changes purchases. It turns out there's no correlation with the next year or the next year after that. It is limited to a 2-year change, but you do get a different picture with the 2-year change than I did originally when I did this work. I only looked at the 1-year change because that's where you begin, of course. Well, with the 2-year change, those are shown in the green bars. We get a beautifully symmetrical relationship between the green bars and the blue bars. And what it's telling us is that the private sector contracts to roughly the same extent, if not a little bit more, than the federal government part of the economy increases. That's in the left-hand bar. But it's symmetrical too. In the fifth bar on the right, we have the private sector bouncing back dramatically when the federal purchases are cut. So what you've got is a kind of balancing mechanism whereby the private sector compensates for whatever the federal government does, and maybe a bit more. It's not a perfect one-to-one relationship. It's a bit more than one-to-one in this graph. And the phrase used historically over a long period of time for this has been crowding out. That when the federal government spends in this particular way, the private sector becomes that much smaller. So it's called crowding out. It could also be called crowding in. If the federal government backs off and reduces its spending, the private sector rushes in to occupy the vacuum. So this is a relationship between federal spending and the economy, which you wouldn't see very easily unless you analyzed these correlations. And it may very well be, as I want to keep emphasizing, it may well be more complicated even than this. And this is already so complicated that most people are not going to see it unless they practice a pretty good effort in putting the data together and analyzing it. Moving on, I'd like to look at transfer payments. And I find a rather different story here. Now, the theory of transfer payments would be that if the federal government gives money to a deserving cause, it could be people who are in dire straits, it'll help them get back on their feet. And when they do that, of course, they rejoin the economy. So one belief is that federal spending boosts the economy. That's one of the reasons why it might boost the economy, and there are others. If you actually divide the data into subhistories again, according to how much did federal spending increase or decline, I've done this with 4 bars in this diagram, which 4 is enough to make my point. And I find that the middle 2 bars give me the same GDP growth on the average. And another way of saying that is the effect of an increase, a relatively small increase in federal transfer payment spending on GDP is pretty small. It's not visible in a graph that is at this level of aggregation. However, if you go to the left and look at the left-hand bar, or if you go to the right-hand bar, they give you very strong results. So you have a strong correlation with large increases in spending or cuts in spending, the unusual cases, the outliers, but you have a relatively weak, if not no relationship at all, with small changes in spending. Overall, though, it's undoubtedly an inverse correlation. It's hard to find evidence for this vast effort on the federal government's part to bail people who are in trouble out of their difficulties and put them back in the economy. That mechanism doesn't seem to show up in the aggregate data. And the opposite mechanism, in which people accept the money but they don't go back to work, they just enjoy the money, and this would happen especially if the amount of money being spent were large, if the difference between the recipient and the donor was very, very distant and wide, and for all sorts of other reasons, you could have what broadly is a disincentive effect on getting back in the economy as a result of receiving money, especially on a very large scale. So that's what I have on transfer payments, but there's a lot more to do. As I mentioned, different kinds of transfer payments may have different effects. Much more work. In fact, the work is endless. I'd like to switch now in the sixth exhibit to taxation. And here are some of the broad statistics of taxation going back to the 1950 area, 1949 area. And I'm looking at taxation, that especially in terms of the rate of taxation. Of course, the highest rates are paid by the highest income people. And when the government changes the tax system, it changes it in such a way that the whole ladder of different tax rates for different levels of income moves collectively. So the top bracket, which is shown here, is enough to represent the general tendency of tax rates. Because there's a consistency with which the government changes lower tax rates and higher tax rates. And we see here that the top individual tax bracket was as high as 90%, 91% perhaps. It had been even higher than that, I think, during World War II. The two major changes over time occurred in the Kennedy administration. There was a big tax cut, almost forgotten about it now, and then another even bigger one during the Reagan administration. And so over the history, the top tax bracket and all the other high tax brackets along with it have come down. But revenue as a percentage of GDP, as you see, has stayed about the same. I'm coming to a more detailed look at that in a moment. So there isn't a parallel between how high the tax rate it might be on income and how much revenue you receive. We have we have a breakage between those two things, which is a very important theme and the source of a good deal of doubt. For instance, in the very almost universal belief that if we were to reduce taxes, federal taxes, it would widen the budget deficit. Turns out that may not be true. And I'll show you very shortly the statistics behind that. I've also included the Social Security tax rate, the marginal rate, both the employer's portion and the employee's portion combined. And as you see, that's running around 16% now, having grown from about 2% in 1950. That should be part of my analysis too, but it makes it more complicated, and I've left it out in what I'm going to show you in a couple of minutes, just for simplicity's sake. So what I'm going to be showing you could be considered conservative because it doesn't include the Social Security tax. So on to the next slide. One of my, this looks at the long history. Again, I was able to go back to 1840 and pick up what was the top tax rate all the way back. And I've divided the years into those in which that top tax rate, which carrying all the other rates with it, was raised the most and changed relatively little, or was even lowered in many years. Those are the three subhistories that I use here, and they're all peacetime subhistories. Just in case I separated the war years, or the war decades in this case, from the peace decades, in case we had different behavior. And I then concentrate on the peacetime behavior, which of course affects is applicable most of the time. And you see there in the test that the years or the decades in which the top tax rate was raised the most, we get the lowest GDP growth. When it was lowered the most, we get the highest GDP growth. So that's a good illustration of the old adage that if you tax something, you get more of it. And to which you could add, if you tax something at a higher rate, you get even less of it. I don't know if I said that right. If you tax something, you get less of it. But if you tax something at a higher rate, you get even less still. So there's some confirmation that, but it's very, very broad brush. Going on to the next slide, this is one of my favorite slides. I didn't find this myself. This discovery was made by an economist called Kurt Hauser, who ran a large investment firm in San Francisco for many years, and met him in the last few years of his life. He made this evidence pretty famous by featuring it in a series of Wall Street Journal editorial features. And I picked it up from there. It was right up my street, as you can already tell. And I started drawing the data and updating it and so forth. So this is a recent update of that relationship that he had found, taking us all the way, I think it goes all the way to 2023. And it's similar to one of my earlier graphs. You can see, because I'm taking a very, very long history in which the size of what we're dealing with has changed drastically, we have to use a ratio scale. So there's that. And we see that in the 1920s and especially the 30s, tax revenue, plotted vertically, was growing quite a bit faster than income or gross domestic product. Until about 1949, there seems to have been a kind of a tipping point or a barrier, and the ratio between tax receipts, federal tax receipts, and GDP reaches a point there beyond which it refuses to go. And all the way from 1949 to the present, 2023, the relationship between receipts and income has been a parallel relationship. I mentioned this at the beginning of the presentation. You see it very visibly in this graph. It's like a barrier. No matter what you do to the tax rates, whether you raise them or decline, have them fall, the tax rates don't make any difference to the relationship between total revenue collected and GDP. You could say this is the infamous Laffer curve at work. What the Laffer curve does is simply make the point that there is a tipping point if you raise tax rates too high, and that's pretty well known, but no one knows where the tipping point is. So it could be argued the Laffer curve isn't relevant until we find the evidence in a graph like this, where we see the tipping point loud and clear. It's very plain, and I'm still speaking, of course, broad brush here, but it's very plain that having a tax rate higher than 20% doesn't, on the average, produce any revenue. And that's because when you tax something, you get more of it, you get less of it, and a higher tax rate than 20 is enough to reduce the tax base through people looking for ways to avoid taxes or simply reducing their effort level or looking for loopholes. Whatever the mechanism is, you just can't collect the revenue beyond that point. And this graph shows how really pronounced this tendency is, how strong the evidence is for a very pronounced effect, and one that has been in effect for decades and doesn't seem to be changing even in modern times, where so much of economic surroundings are so different than what they were in 1949. But this is, I call it a law, or you could call it Hauser's law or Hauser's rule, but it's very firmly in place over an extraordinarily long period of time. I'd like to move now on to Federal Reserve policy. And this is a graph I published quite a few years ago, as you see. It's not been necessary to update it, although it's always a good idea to update one's graphs. This is a graph which divides the history chronologically. These are decades, all the way back to the earliest time that the Federal Reserve was consistently, systematically using the short-term interest rate in the federal funds market as an economic weapon to combat inflation. And the arguments were made all the way back in the 1950s that what was going on was that the federal government, the Federal Reserve was, by using tight monetary policy, weakening the economy. And if monetary policy were tight enough, it might be enough to create a recession. And some critics of the Fed argued back in those days that the Fed had created recessions. What I've done here is to divide the whole history, which only goes up to 2003 in this graph, but it could very easily be updated, into decades. And you see there the correlation between what the Fed did and how the economy responded was at its strongest in the earliest decade and got weaker as each decade passed, especially in the 1980s and 90s. And once you're in back into the 21st century, then the effect was really not visible anymore, or barely visible. So what this is one of those cases where a correlation is pretty strong. And if you measure it in the normal way by taking all the evidence together and estimating the average correlation that's there, you can miss something that's going on underneath, whereby the correlation has a strength which is changing over time, changing systematically over time in this case. So we have a situation here where it's possible to make the argument that the Fed, through tight monetary policy, was able to reduce the size of the economy, which were for the purpose of inflation, of course, inflation control, which I'll come to in a minute. But that is not working today, not working in the last couple of decades from all of the data I've seen, and stopped working sometime in the 1990s. That's going to be relevant when we look at the Federal Reserve's effect on inflation. If we go to Exhibit 10, you'll see an attempt on my part to measure how much impact the Fed's rate actions have had, in this case on CPI inflation. And I started with the notion that the effect must show up within about 18 months. I'd be very surprised if it took longer. At least that was my view at the beginning. And I've counted the months, and what I've done is to divide the history now only twofold. The Fed can increase rates or it can cut rates. And of course, it tends to increase rates when inflation is higher than those periods in which it tends to cut rates. So we have two lines, and I've measured those lines month by month. So I'm looking at what the effect is contemporaneously in month 0, and then I'm allowing for a lag of 1 month, a lag of 2 months, 3 months, 4, all the way up to 18, to see where is it in that time frame that the inflation rate starts to dip, if the Fed is raising rates, or to increase if the Fed is lowering rates. And I don't find it. There are several reasons why I don't find it, but this is the first issue that comes up. One, you might say this is an undercutting the belief that the Fed has great power today to reduce inflation and with reasonable speed, let's say within 18 months, by raising interest rates. This graph doesn't support that belief, but the full truth is no doubt much more complicated, and I can show you in the next few slides some of those complications. What I do next is to allow for a longer time frame than 18 months. And I use annual data, not monthly data, and we can get a somewhat simpler graph. The other change I make is to look at how the inflation rate changes and not merely at the cumulative inflation that we've experienced. And now I get a picture in which there isn't much effect on the inflation rate for at least 12 months. There starts to be an effect within between 12 and 18, and most of the effect shows up with a longer time frame than 18 months, maybe as long as 30 months. So here is evidence that the Fed has an effect on the inflation rate, and this is the entire time frame from 1955 to date. But I mentioned earlier that the Fed's power to change GDP growth had changed a great deal over that long time frame. And in my final graph, I show two different sub-histories for the Fed's effect on inflation. That would be Exhibit 12. On the left, I'm looking at the first part of the history. It turns out I had 66 years of data. So I took the first 22 years, which stretches from 1957, no, 88, no, oh, I'm sorry, I divided it two ways. 66 years can be divided into two 33-year periods. So on the left, we've got the early 33-year period, and we see an even larger, more impressive version of the graph we were just looking at, where it does take time for the Fed's impact to take effect. It doesn't start until between 12 and 18 months, and only a small part of it is taking place that soon. But if you wait to between 24 and 30 months, then finally the inflation rate does come down. It's very impressive. But that's what happened between 1955 and 1988. On the right-hand side, I do the same thing, but I start in 1988 and I go up to 2024. Now, totally different story. There's very little evidence that a very small amount of evidence in favor of the Fed's effect bringing inflation down, or if it raises rates, or bringing inflation up if it cuts rates. It's a very much smaller amount of change, and is going to be barely visible at all until well after 18 months. So this, the detailed picture supports the broad brush picture that I mentioned at the beginning, but it is a more complicated story. But in the end, it is something that undercuts the widespread view that the Fed has tremendous power today to reduce inflation and to reduce it quickly. The evidence for that is really completely absent. And that's where I'd like to quit my formal remarks. I can say a little bit about tariffs, but I don't have the work done on tariffs to be able to demonstrate what I can say about them in the same way that I could do in these slides that I've shared with you.
So thank you all for joining us. David, Meg behind the scenes, thank you again.